So everybody popping in here as I see. Cool. Very warm welcome also from my end to the second DevExConf. As Michael and Pauline shared, it's kind of a conference that is purely dedicated to make developers happier and also more productive. And all of us here have the honor today, I think, to be the first conference panel, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. As Michael mentioned, my name is Johannes. I'm one of the co-founders and co-CEOs at Gitpod. Yes, we have two CEOs here. We like collaboration and dual leadership. And I will host today's panel that is all about the emerging category of remote development. Personally, I still can remember very vividly hosting and organizing the first DevExConf, which is roughly 1 year ago. I think it was end of April. And since that, a lot of things have changed during the last 12 months. And when it comes also specifically to remote development. Part of my job is to tell the same story over and over and over again, essentially. And Sven, my co-CEO, always jokes that, or uses the great analogy that we must feel sometimes like Radiohead playing Creep over and over again. And if you tell that same story to people, it's very interesting to see how they react. And I think over the last year, I think some of you have experienced similar things. A lot of the discussions and conversations we had have started to shift from, okay, why are you doing this, to how are you doing this? And in my opinion, there are two main reasons for that. The first one is that Microsoft and GitHub, which are presented today by Nik and Christof, kind of entered the market, and Codespaces went live in August. Then JetBrains, presented today by Kirill, entered the market in November last year. And with that, you essentially have the majority of the IDE and editing experience market having built-in remote functionality. And I think that really put remote development at the forefront as a new category in the modern software development lifecycle. So I'm very happy to have all of you here. Michael already quickly introduced us, and I think given the time, I would say let's just jump in directly. The first question touches a bit of the why of remote development. It's literally a question to everybody. And maybe let's start, I picked the order here, and let's start with Nik. What does remote development kind of mean for you? And what are kind of top 3 use cases and benefits that you're seeing?
Yeah, thanks, Johannes. Thanks for having us. It's exciting to be here today. Remote development to me is really kind of a means to an end in a lot of ways. It's about removing friction in the developer workflow and that experience, right? And we've said developer experience, I don't know, probably 100 times already today. It's a good thing it's not a drinking game. That would be a bad thing to be doing right now. And so, but that's really what it's about, right? Being remote gives us these opportunities to do things that have traditionally been difficult to do locally, right? Being remote means being in the cloud and kind of having the ability to kind of scale up or down or get access to maybe a piece of hardware or a capability that you don't have locally. And then it also, that's kind of one piece of it. And the other piece of it is just kind of that getting past all of the minutia that we all know so well as developers, getting into the right context, getting everything configured the right way so that you can actually start to contribute value to your company, to your project, to your community. Whatever the reason is that you're writing the code that you're writing is not to like fiddle with Python virtual environments, right? That's just yak shaving that we have to do. And so really it's about removing kind of all of that yak fur, getting into the value. And so that to me is what remote development is really all about.
Yeah, fully agree. Christof, what is it for you in China, essentially? And maybe you can touch on 3 benefits or use cases you see most common.
Yeah, it's mostly what Nik just said. It's really maybe me rephrasing here, but I see it as having 2 sides. One is that first of all, we want to bring a remote machine to the local machine in a way that makes resources like the CPU power, or maybe there's some specialized hardware involved as well, that we want to bring that to the local machine in a way that that makes it usable just like local developer resources. So we want to have, like, we take it maybe for granted now, but we want to have IntelliSense, we want to have linting, everything that we're used to from a local development environment, right? We want to have available as well. And I think the other side then is, of course, that if the remote is, if that's a container, it's really easy to create and also recreate. And so what we want to capture there is we want to capture how this development container is being created in a sort of development container configuration. That's at least how we call it. And that configuration can then also share through the project repository and make it available to the team and maybe the wider community.
Yeah, I think we'll, on that recipe part, we'll definitely speak about later on, because I think that's very interesting also if you look at the general industry. Kirill, kind of JetBrains did kind of not directly go essentially into the browser when it comes to remote development. And I think I'd love to hear, what remote development essentially means for you, because I think that's a very important distinction and a trap oftentimes also people fall into, where they put, at least we see that, hey, it's an online IDE, but it's so much more than that. Maybe you can explain a bit.
Yeah, hi all. It's great to be here, and I would also like to second what just Nik and Christof said. It's all true. We emphasize, I think, three major improvements, principal improvements, which bring along the remote development as a concept. First, of course, is the performance. Second is the security, because you no longer have the source code on your laptop or whatever local machine you're using for. And also, you've mentioned the containerization, which is kind of like shareability, accessibility stuff, when you can access or maybe share containerized development environment with your with your colleagues, with your team, with anybody, or maybe you can access the same backend server from multiple devices, which is very useful as well. Yeah, regarding the online IDE, we just product-wise, we believe in more like a thin client rather than a browser type of editing. I think it's like a fundamental distinction for us, because we think that browser conceptually is kind of a different story. We are not sure about that, so it's a like strategic bit, but we'll see. But of course, it's not the only way, and in the future we'll work in both directions. But firstly, definitely we wanted to start with the thin client, and I'm quite confident that everyday professionals, they tend to use the thin client for remote development much more than programming in the browser.
Cool. Ending this with Chris, it's funny that I can interview you here. Actually, what would you say? And I mean, I know probably the answer, but if we speak with our clients and customers, what are the kind of top 3 benefits that come to mind?
Yeah, thanks, Johannes. A lot of these things have been mentioned. Automation clearly plays a big role. So turning that eventually outdated README into something that a machine can run instead of a human being, really saving time. We have customers that quote us that they're saving 5 hours per developer per week because that yak shaving goes away. They don't have to wade through all that configuration drift and make it work on their machine. So that's clearly one of the benefits. The other is the resources. You no longer need to buy really high-end M1 Max or what have you just to run ever-increasing complexity of software that we build these days. And lastly, I think one point that wasn't touched on so much yet is endpoint security and also endpoint flexibility in that sense. So not only do you not have source code or credentials on your local machine that someone walks out of any building or sits in a cafe where you have little idea on what's going on the network or who might do what to your machine. You also can now do things that previously, from a compliance perspective or from a security team perspective, was not available to you. So we've seen customers where users were not allowed to run, for example, Docker containers on their local machines. And with remote development, that's suddenly possible because it is not a local machine. It is the cloud, quote unquote, where running containers is kind of what we do on this thing. So we see that a lot of flexibility in what users can do gets enabled through remote development.
Cool. Yeah, I fully agree. One thing I potentially would add is also the collaboration aspect, which gets more and more interesting, because as those environments can be spun up essentially on demand, also, of course, developers can share essentially URLs that give them a full replica and snapshot of the specific environment, but also people in software teams can start to collaborate. So we have a lot of QA folks, we have PMs, etc., that now can browse code again without needing to set up all of that stuff on their local machine. I'd like to touch a bit the architectural decisions the different players here in the panel did. Kirill, you already started to mention that, but I really want to emphasize and stress that Gitpod for sure was very happy to see opening up the JetBrains IDE fleet with your announcement around remote development last November. And we were quite impressed because the undertaking is impressive, right? You had to potentially refactor a code base that is 10 years old, etc., and bring that to the context or to the world of remote development. How did you approach that, and what were kind of lessons learned along the way?
Well, historically, we started to, break a trail to this remote development path quite long ago, and surprisingly, the product which started this was Rider, the well-known .NET IDE by JetBrains. What's so special about Rider is that it is the first JetBrains IDE which separated backend and the front end. Although both of them are run locally on the same machine, still they have the protocol between them, and it was the first, though quite gigantic step for us. Then we adapted this protocol for a collaboration feature for all IntelliJ related IDEs for the Code With Me feature. For a collaboration feature, when a guest now connects to the host with the same protocol, but now they're separated worldwide and they are no longer on the same machine. And then we've concluded with the remote development, imagining like you connecting to yourself, to your own server. And since collaboration might demand 70-80% of features, when you are talking about remote development, it has to be more or less complete. It has to be, it must have most of the daily routine accessible for a developer. Apart from that, we also invested a lot in the infrastructure issues. How do you correctly organize the architecture to support orchestrator vendors, how to do it without orchestrators via the SSH, for example, how to do it on premise, or how to do it, or how to download the thin clients appropriately. So yeah, it was kind of a hard work, but I'm quite happy we're here, and I'm quite happy that lots of developers already are using remote development. We see this feedback. They really battle testing this every day in different scenarios, and we are very happy to be part of this quite fundamental move in development experience. Also, it's so important that the next IDE by JetBrains, which is Fleet, is designed to be remote development ready from the very beginning. So its architecture implies that you no longer just develop, a desktop IDE. from this day on, you develop a backend IDE and a desktop IDE, which is just another representation of it. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. Christof, I think VS Code published, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I got the timeline not right, but the remote development extension of VS Code was published roughly 2 years ago, I think. And you've been with VS Code really pioneering the architectural separation between front end on the one end and back end on the other end. Over those 2 years, what kind of adoption have you seen? And how do you also think remote functionality within VS Code will evolve from here onwards?
Yes, well, that's right. Yes. So what we've seen quite strong adoption actually when it comes to using the remote development in VS Code with WSL on Windows, and also with SSH servers in the cloud. And we see growing adoption of what we call the dev container JSON or dev container configuration file when it comes to development with containers. And that's also kind of what we've been working on recently. So, for example, Codespaces has also supports dev container JSON and configuration, and we are actually sharing the implementation for that support behind the scenes. So they both use the same implementation for creating a dev container. That ensures that we have equal support in both GitHub Codespaces and also what we call the remote containers extension for VS Code. And now, when we started to look into how we could drive adoption more of the dev container JSON, we reached out to open source projects and started to submit PRs for adding a dev container JSON to their repository, because that will basically enable that repository for remote development from our side. And we quickly noticed that there was a lot of pushback towards our suggestion of adding a proprietary configuration file to open source projects. And so what that inspired us to do actually is look into opening up the spec for the dev container JSON. And so what we've been working on recently is really getting documentation and into shape for opening up that specification. And what we are doing together with that, I should actually mention that we want to make it VS Code agnostic. So anyone who has looked into the dev container JSON might have noticed that there are like extensions and maybe settings that are VS Code specific, but we've already found a way to move these under some kind of customization format, customization property in the dev container JSON actually. So it will be VS Code agnostic. And we've also been working on making a reference implementation available, and that will be available as open source. So this is work in progress. It's not, none of this is published yet, but this is something that we're looking forward to make available. And so the reference implementation I mentioned, we're making available as a CLI. So the CLI will be able to spin up a dev container. And what's interesting about that actually is that this can be reused in CI. So if you imagine running CI, you could reuse your dev containers in CI. And you can also, if your dev container uses a Docker file that maybe takes a long time to build, you can also use then that CLI to pre-build the image in CI. So that's what we're working on. It's not quite ready yet for being published, but we are already well into making this happen. And in fact, the latest releases of the remote containers extension for VS Code are already running on this new architecture using that reference implementation, or soon to be reference implementation for the OpenSpec.
Interesting. Yeah, I think we will come to that in roughly 10-15 minutes, because I think that whole dev environment configuration file standardization is very interesting, because there is right now kind of a lot of different standards that are essentially pushed from different vendors. Before we do that, Nik, I wanted to quickly get your assessment on, I mean, similar code spaces and Gitpod both have that duality between, hey, you can use a desktop, but you can also use a browser. How are you strategically thinking about that at Codespaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I've certainly worked in these environments where the developer experience extends beyond even getting the laptop. I think of this one time when I was consulting for a big bank in New York City, where I waited a week to get a machine placed on my desk. I spent all day that Friday installing a bunch of stuff, came back on Monday, and the machine was gone because they accidentally removed my machine thinking I was the old employee, and I had to wait a week again, right? And so part of the developer experience we think about very holistically, and it's not just from the moment when you've actually logged into that machine, but it's provisioning that machine. And so what we really want to do is we want to be able to enable developers to very quickly get up and running. And that means maybe not dealing with their procurement department to get a key for a thing that they need to install, whereas opposed to just firing up the default browser that they have on their machine and getting into that development environment. Now, that said, it is our goal at GitHub and in Codespaces to make developers feel like they're at home, even if they're in this remote environment, even if they're away. And so we like to provide, as you mentioned, Johannes, choice, right? So if you want to use the desktop experience, if that is something that you're comfortable with and you prefer, go for it. If you're in a machine or a situation where you don't have that, or you just want to quickly fire off a quick change or PR, open up in a browser tab and fire away, right? And I mean, that extends for us too. There's a lot of developers who don't prefer graphical editors at all, and they want to use a terminal. And so we have a terminal first based experience that's available for those kind of developers to use. So, our opinion is that it's the developer's opinion that matters. And so we will support whatever that makes the developer happy and productive.
Makes a lot of sense. I think I would like to move a bit to the backend now. I mean, we touched a bit the kind of client side of things, and the orchestration part is also very important when we speak about remote development. One big question, Nik, we also ask ourselves at Gitpod a lot, and Chris can definitely share more around that, is what kind of machines we essentially run our workloads on. There are VMs, there are containers, we have micro VMs coming up. You have completely different architectures, such as or different machine types, such as GPUs. And what was kind of driving your decision to choose VMs instead of containers at Codespaces?
Yeah, I think it boils down again to what is the developer's experience holistically. And so what does that experience look like after they've released some software into the world? What does it look like when they're dealing with an issue or a hot fix or a problem? And what does the stress put on them? And how can the developer environment help lead them into the pit of success where the things that they're doing are just the right things to do? And so for us, part of the reason why we ended up choosing VMs as the thing that we hand to each individual developer, as opposed to a container, which isn't actually true. We give both. It is a container running in a VM. What we don't do is a multi-tenant container architecture where we have multiple containers for different users running on the same VM. The reason why we don't do that is we just saw too many instances of people being able to break out of the isolation layer provided by containers on Linux, and thus get down to the host OS that is at the VM and get access to maybe other containers. And with all of the recent kind of supply chain attacks, where there's these sophisticated attacks going directly after developer infrastructure and using that as the entry point to then kind of infect upstream or additional customers, we just didn't really want to do that. And so with Codespaces, you do get all of the configuration and flexibility benefits and portability benefits of the container, but because the VM is the hardened secure isolation layer, we leave that as the layer that every developer gets, that there's no way that somebody else could like break in, or they could even break out and harm even a teammate. You know, Christof and I work for the same company, but we don't share our passwords with each other, right? There's his credentials and my credentials, and we want to keep that audit trail intact as well.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. Chris, we built kind of Thea because kind of we had to, and essentially started with Gitpod, the development or the remote development journey in the browser. Last Thursday, we announced our strategic partnership with JetBrains, which allows you now, as Kirill already mentioned, to connect from your desktop IDEs. We got for like in Twitter, etc., the question that it feels like a shift in strategy. So what happened there?
A break in perception, I want to say. So Gitpod's always been about automating development environments, about remote development environments, and not about being an online IDE. And at the time, we had to build Thea because that was the easiest way we could make that accessible and how we could sort of get the idea out. At the time, we thought that, you know, picking people up from something that might seem somewhat familiar, like an online IDE, something that runs in their browser would make sense. Because if you throw all of that at once at people, like, you know, this stuff no longer runs on your laptop, all this setup that you've been curating for so long is no longer on your machine. And hey, by the way, you're also going to use this weird thing that you've never seen before. So we try to produce an experience that is close to something that people knew. Over time, we saw that things started to open up. So VS Code, you could run that in the browser a bit later. So we went on that, adopted that, and now also with JetBrains, which is awesome. This is a logical step in this progression, and it's to the same tune what Nik said earlier. It's the developer's opinion that matters. So we capture that in our core values as a company, where we say we want to integrate, don't dictate. It's also what Michael mentioned earlier. And so the browser is a convenient thing. It lets you do things that on a desktop you would struggle. So on any given day, I'll have, I don't know, 10 tabs open, no problem, 10 parallel dev environments doing different things. That I would struggle to do that on a desktop. So there's a place for that. But there is also a place for the desktop. It's an experience that we know. It's our keyboard shortcuts. It's our Alt tab into the window. It's just things we're very familiar with. And so there's a place for all of those. There's also a place for the terminal. You know, you want to SSH into your workspace because I know your tools work like that. You want to copy stuff. There's a place for all of those things. And so Gitpod's always been about automating the setup of that environment. And then we try to give you access to that in as many ways as we can make it work.
Yeah, and I think really the point here that is very important, and we mentioned that previously, is that over the past months, essentially, you really have seen that opening up and democratization of different editing experiences to allow remote development as they are built. Like Kirill spoke about Fleet, we will have also throughout DevExConf, for example, a talk about SAD, which is a new editor. And all of those things are essentially built with both local and a remote development experience as they come out. And I think that is, what all of the people here see, but also what the kind of larger market is progressing towards. Let's speak about the configuration files. So Christof already shared some background on the dev container and JSON format. There is, in fact, a lot of discussion to drive standardization around the various formats that today define developer environments out there. I think there is, for us, we have a Gitpod YAML. You have, for code spaces or VS Code, there's the dev container file. Red Hat runs their dev file, I think it's called. So a lot of different recipes that at the end do kind of similar things. If there is a magic wand we have, and we think about how a joint standard for developer environments configuration could look like. Kirill, what would be your take on that?
I think if we want to develop ID agnostic type of format, which would work for any kind of IDEs, then it should be obviously capable of doing the basic IDE operations without knowing which IDE it will be used for. So I think we've looked a little bit at dev file configuration, which is basically the Docker compose plus subsection regarding the commands, which describe how to do some basic stuff with the IDEs. For example, how do you build, how do you debug, how do you run tests? So you can basically wrap these commands and implement in your IDEs respectively. And from what I see, this format basically fits all the needs we want to have for backend projects, and which is still the IDE agnostic format. But I don't think it's. We just have to come up with a single format. I don't say that dev file is the only one for sure. So, but I strongly believe that if we are talking here, frankly, about development experience and thinking about developers at first, then we have to come up with a single format which should support all kind of IDEs. So, yeah. It would be interesting to hear Nik's and Christof's opinions here. What do they think about the other formats other than they are primarily supporting for? And from JetBrains side, we're totally ready for collaborate here, and I think it is the beneficial for all parties if we'll come up to some single format here.
Then handing over that question to Christof and Nik.
Yes, so well, we're really opening up the specification because we're hoping for involvement not only from the community but also from other products, really. And the same goes for the reference implementation that we're going to make available. And I think it makes a lot of sense to think about a common standard. So far, my thinking has been that there's also value in having, you know, different approaches. And so when we look at the different configuration files, I can see some value in having more than one format as we start to allow for the individual, you know, innovation as well. But ultimately, I think we will see some progress towards a common standard. Not sure we're already there, but as we open up the specifications, not just ours, others as well, right? I think we're getting to that discussion of a common standard. That, of course, would be beneficial because it will be much easier to support one common format on the product side, and also much easier to adopt by projects.
What would be, what do you think is a governance model that could work for defining such a standard?
Yeah, well, at the moment, really, what we imagine doing with the open specification is that we would still be in charge of the format for now, right? We've used that approach quite successfully, I think, with the language server protocol, which is the LSP, which is a entirely different thing, but that governance format has worked very well. But we'll see how this will develop over time as others join the discussion and help shape the future of the specification.
Chris,
you know,
Nik, yeah.
I'll just add in on that. I mean, I think anything that we can do to kind of make things easy and portable in that order is definitely the right thing to be doing for developers. I think we're all kind of have those same goals, right? There's many different concerns that these dev environment configuration files address today, right? From like what does the build process look like? What does the runtime look like? What is the extensions that go in your editor? What is some of your editor configurations? plus, plus, plus. And so when I look across the market, it's, the organizations that are on this call and a few other key ones, but then there's also community efforts that are very specific and catered towards those communities. So I think about something like the folks kind of doing Jupyter notebooks, right? And they leverage repo to Docker, and that's their convention for describing what their environment looks like. And it doesn't go quite as far as to describing what the editor looks like, because it's really kind of formed around Jupyter Notebook as kind of really that entry point, or Jib in the Java Maven community, right? And they kind of have a way that they describe how they containerize. The other thing that I'll throw in there as an extra thought is, we find that the path to containerization, it still has a long way to go on the developer side. I know we've been talking about containers for a long time, but if you go and you start looking at what containers are built and pre-built and the things that kind of help people get started, it very much targets production workloads, which is an entirely different set of tools than what the developer needs when they're actually kind of working on their inner loop, building their program interactively. And so I think some simplicity needs to be added in to help developers, particularly new developers who are just kind of onboarding right now into the industry, to be able to get these environments up and running quickly.
There's a lot of good things have been said here. I specifically like the fact that you're opening the dev container JSON. I think that's definitely a right move. Like, three main concerns come to mind when it's about standardizing at this point. And one is, again, governance model and sort of a level playing field. So with any sort of standardization effort, no matter driven by whom, I think this needs to be a level playing field, in the sense that there is no single organization that gets to say, yes, this goes in or this doesn't. Because what happens is, if there is at that point almost competing interests at some point, those who don't get to exert that much influence, their innovation at some point becomes proprietary. And so you're no longer innovating, but you're moving out of the standard. You're doing something that doesn't run elsewhere. And so all of a sudden, it's no longer necessarily a positive thing. That comes to the second point, that is sort of compatibility. So we see a proliferation of sort of some complexity being baked into, and this makes a lot of sense. We're still experimenting. We're still trying to figure out, what do you need in such a specification, and maybe what do you not need, and sort of the containerization, Nik, that you just mentioned, 100% with you. Today, it's really hard to build a Docker file and an image that works for you as a developer. We've learned how to do this for production workloads, but as a developer, it's still tough, and we got to do something about that. And so we're experimenting with what could that look like. And so there is still this going back and forth in the discussion on how this is going to work. Now, whatever standard we come up with, we want to make sure that there is a good enough overlap that can be produced amongst the different platforms that will implement the standard, because otherwise it becomes worthless. Like, a good point, or it becomes less meaningful. A good reason why, for example, OCI and the ecosystem around that is so successful is because even though there are many different vendors of those runtimes, it's not just run C. There's also Yorkie, there's Podman, there are different implementations, and they're successful because they are compatible. And so whatever we do, we got to maintain that compatibility. And lastly, the separation between specification and runtime might be something that we want to look into. Like, there are many, many different ways to build a container. There are many different builders for that, but the runtime is the same. And so the runtime is compatible. The way you specify it isn't. So long as you can convert them, so long as they speak a common language and concepts are similar, this might also work. And then you can still innovate on top of that. So governance model, runtime, and compatibility, I think, are the three key things for getting this standard, whatever it will look like, off the ground.
Makes, I think, a lot of sense. And looking at the time, we just have 5 minutes left, but we definitely should take that discussion to another online place and continue that, because I think there is a lot of value in thinking about standardization here. So there were some questions from the audience that we get, and one is essentially, let me scroll down or up here. It's kind of, yeah, so here, how do folks building remote development tooling hope to bridge the gap to UI-based elements of development workflows? So video games, mobile apps with emulators, etc. Whoever is fastest can take that question.
Well, I can try, for example, for game developers to answer for game developers. And if you look at one of the major game dev vendor, which is Unity, they recently acquired Parsec, which is basically a video transferring tool to do remote development for Unity Editor. But you do not do just Unity Editor to make games. Apart from that, you can use, for example, Rider to write your C# scripts for these games. And bringing corresponding tools to remote development routine will help the overall process to move towards remote development. So IDEs help that, but speaking of a game development, we need to think about other aspects of this. For example, audio development or rendering or some other tooling which is around game development. But definitely we see this move right now, this movement, and the last acquisition of Parsec by Unity means that the industry is there. Unfortunately, or maybe luckily, we cannot control everything. There are lots of players, lots of tooling. It's an ecosystem of tooling. And all of these tools, they tend to do this separately. But the tendency is that the overall industry goes to remote development. And this is great.
I can say what about the embedded side, and it's to a similar tune. We do see some pulled in the embedded space towards remote development. So things like Platform IO or Goliath IO make stuff of that possible. Also, the proliferation of Web USB is a great helper here. And the embedded space really feels that pain of configuration and setting things up, and a lot of tools that you need in order to do your job. And so they greatly benefit from that side of remote development environment. So there's also a lot of pressure and pain that could be solved through remote dev. And I'm very confident that we'll see embedded development move into remote development environments in the coming years.
Great. Maybe one final question to Nik from Khalid, which is how can remote development vendors ensure they don't disenfranchise folks living in areas without strong internet connections?
Yeah, this is something that our team actually talks about a lot, and is part of the reason why, as Christof mentioned earlier, that both Codespaces, which is our cloud-based platform, and the remote development containers, which is a local platform, share an implementation. And so what that means is, and I've actually done this myself, when I'm hopping on a train, I'm going to be underground or something like that, I can clone my repo locally and I can spin up VS Code, which will run Docker locally and basically give me what amounts to an offline Codespaces support. And so that is something that kind of at GitHub and at Microsoft, we certainly want to do and have in place. There are some things that we can do to make it better still that we'll continue to work on. But I think that part of it kind of the questions around standardization and making sure that we have multiple vendors kind of all contributing into this space will enable, we call it remote development, but remote does not say how far the cable has to be that connects the two together, right? It could be just a couple of inches inside of your machine, or it could literally be miles and miles and miles apart. And we want to approach that enables both of them. And there are pros and cons to having it in the cloud versus having it local, and we want to enable both of those. And I think when we talk to folks like at Gitpod and JetBrains, they're in the same boat.
100%. I think that's a very great way to end. So thanks everybody for taking the time today. And yeah, I definitely think we should continue some of these discussions offline. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Thank
all. Have a
you.
great day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.